everyone, and welcome to the webinar. I'd like to welcome you to the Connecting Fire Science and Management webinar series. And the webinar series is put on by 3 organizations. I want to recognize all 3 of them to start out. And that's the International Association of Wildland Fire, the Wildland Fire Lessons Learned Center, and the Joint Fire Science Program. And I encourage everyone to go to the websites of all 3 of those organizations. They're all doing great stuff, and I'm sure you can find something of interest there. On to today a little, or upcoming webinars. Next. The next webinar is going to be December 2nd, so right after Thanksgiving. Brett Butler is going to be talking about some new research he's done on safety zones. And I think you'll find that really interesting. I have a feeling that one's going to generate a lot of interest. So go ahead and register early for that one if you can. And how you register for the webinars, if you're not going to wait for the announcement to come out. And we will be seeing an announcement out about that one next week, but if you'd like to register now, you can go to the Wildland Fire Lessons Learned Center website, which I'm showing right here, and then go to the Advances in Fire Practice. So there's a couple spots to get there right at the top. That's a rolling link, so that might not be up where it says AFP. But over to the right, there's a column of sort of the main sections of the LLC website, and one of those is Advances in Fire Practice. Click on that, and it brings you to this page, which has the registration links for the webinars, but it also has recordings for previous webinars, including today's. So after today's webinar, we'll post the recording up here, and then you can use that link to get to it and pass that link on to anyone that you think might be interested. Okay, so on to today's webinar real quick. First, for questions, we save questions till the end, so if a question comes up, type it into the questions box in your control panel, and at the end we'll have a Q&A session, and I'll read through those, and Nick will respond. Also, like I mentioned, the webinar is being recorded, and it'll be up on this web page that you're looking at right here on your screen. Like the previous webinar from October 8th, Dave Calkins' webinar, you can see the link there, the view recorded webinar link. So that's where you can find that link. I get lots of questions about where to find the link to the recording, and there it is. Okay, so on to today. So Nick Skowronski has been a research forester with the USDA Forest Service Northern Research Station since 2007. He's also served as the prescribed burn coordinator at Fort Dix, New Jersey, and as a research technician for the NRS. Nick's research is focused on the impacts that land management activities have on fuel loading, carbon cycling, and habitat quality. He is particularly interested in estimating canopy fuels in 3-dimensional space using lasers on the ground and an aircraft. Having worked formally in fire management, Nick is extremely interested in developing better relationships with scientists and land managers so that research can become more integrated with the needs in the field. Okay, and with that, I will hand it off to Nick.
All right, you guys have that?
Yep.
Oops, sorry. Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for your attendance today. I've been kind of excited about this for a little while here. We're going to talk about estimating canopy bulk density with LiDAR today, and I wanted to start by acknowledging several folks here on this slide that have had a rather large role in this research. They've all contributed rather heavily to this work, and I wanted to take the time to acknowledge them here: Ken Clark, Mike Gallagher, Albert Simeone, and John Hom. I also want to acknowledge that the Joint Fire Science Program for providing funding, primary funding for 2 of the studies that we're going to talk about today. As Josh said, I've had a bit of experience with wildland fire in New Jersey, and I had to throw in the obligatory fire picture here. I think it's the only one in the talk. So this is the system that I'm familiar with. It's a pitch pine overstory in this photo, Pinus rigida, with a scrub oak, Corcus, Licifolia, and Marlandica understory, and a ericaceous layer also in that photo there. So Jersey has a sort of crown fire dominated ecosystem, and we have a 1 million acre pinelands management area in the center of the state. There is a fire issue in New Jersey. We have some of the largest interface areas in the nation probably, and one of the most densely populated states, and a crown fire system make for some interesting management decisions. the state of New Jersey and federal partners there implement a rather rigorous prescribed burn program because of the sort of sensitive nature of the pinelands management area. Most mechanical fuel treatments are pretty much banned, and so fire ends up being the main and only tool for pre-suppression strategy. So I want to quickly go through an overview of what we're going to talk about. We're going to do a quick introduction and background. I want to go over the idea of fuel classification or fuel models and fuel loading. I want to talk about what is LiDAR just in general. I'm sure a lot of you have some familiarity with that technology, but I think it would be important to recap that and look at some of the interesting ways that we're using that data. And then also, the thrust of the talk today is how we're using this on the East Coast to estimate canopy fuels. And we're going to look quickly at 4 individual studies that we've been doing over the last several years. Some of these are new and some of them are a little bit older, but we'll come to those as we move along. So everybody on this call is familiar with this slide, and just to put it in a more national perspective, fire acreage has been increasing over the decades here. We're burning more, we're losing more to fire, and we're all very familiar with this also. We're spending more money also. So we're basically getting less bang for our buck as we move forward here. It's not that I necessarily advocate that burned acreage is a good indication or indicator of how we're doing in the fire suppression community, but it's a very tangible number that we can easily estimate, and it's the same with the dollar figures. Policymakers are concerned about these things, and so it's important to keep this in the back of our mind as to why this is important work. And so one of the primary strategies that we have sort of nationally is this idea of fuels management as a pre-suppression activity. And coming from a crown fire system, I see fuels management for hazardous fuel mitigation, focused on canopy fuels and ladder fuels as being a primary indication of how we're doing, basically the efficacy of what we're doing. If we are reducing those fuels, then we're doing a decent job. We spend a rather large portion of our fire budget every year on pre-suppression activities, including thinning and prescribed fire. One of the issues is that there's sort of unclear guidance on the placement and the return intervals and even how effective these fuel treatments are when we're implementing them. And this is an issue that's come up in several GAO reports, and they're basically citing a lack of available supporting research and questioning the expenditures that we're making on hazardous fuel reduction. So that's sort of the end of the broad brush for me today. Thanks for hanging in there with me. So it would be really nice if we could estimate things at the landscape. Basically, we have to make these we have to make management decisions based on spatial inputs, and it's important that we're able to classify what type of fuel that we have and also the amount of fuel that we have. And so there's sort of two sides to that coin. It's what type of fuel do we have and then how much. And we have a variety of great tools available to us to really classify these fuels in the models and to understand what type of fuel we have and what the behavior characteristics of those fuels are when implemented into the Rothermill spread model. And so we're able to do a really nice job using remotely sensed data sets to really classify those types of fuel classes across the landscape at broad spatial scales. We can do this at various resolutions, and we also have the luxury of time series data where we can take a Landsat data set, for example, that's basically been systematically resampling the Earth for 40 years now, since 1972, and from this spectral reflectance data, we can come up with a really good idea of what the fuels are on the landscape. And land fire is obviously a great example of how that can be done at a national scale. And so we can do that pretty well. And we can also do that relatively easily at the plot level, so sort of at the management scale. We can go out in the woods and we can inventory a plot, and we can use tools that are available to us. For example, the digital photo series from the FARA group, that will basically allow us to categorize what we're looking at and have some idea of the average fuel loading for that plot. And it's very user friendly, and it provides us with a relatively good estimate at the plot level. What we don't have a really good handle on, and that we need a good handle on, is the canopy fuels. There's really no way for us to go out right now and to adequately measure canopy fuels at the landscape scale or at any real management relevant scale. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with using Landsat data for biomass or for anything like that, but typically as you end up with a higher biomass across the landscape, spectral reflectance sensors like Landsat or MODIS tend to saturate, and so they're not able to predict the higher end fuel loadings across the landscape, and you end up with sort of an asymptote there where you're under predicting what's actually there. So today, what we're really interested in is how do we estimate canopy bulk density, and it's sort of an ancillary variable, canopy fuel load. And this figure sort of shows what that is. It's basically the mass that's within a volume in the canopy of the forest. And this is maybe a better depiction of what this sort of looks like, or what this idea is from Bob Keane and others. And it's take a look at that graph on the left, and this is going to sort of be a prevalent theme today, is that basically that foliage area density distribution, or the distribution of canopy fuels. So this zero down here would be the bottom of the canopy, and then as we move up, we end up at the top of the canopy with ladder fuels here, and then the overstory here. And so that's something that we're going to be looking at quite a bit today. So how do we estimate that now is basically where I want to go with this. And so at the plot level, to estimate canopy bulk density, we typically use allometric relationships, and those relationships are based on height and diameter and crown class, or some other variable of interest that we can go out and measure in an individual plot. Basically send a field crew out, and they'll inventory a plot. You can take those values home from the plot. You would plug them into a pretty simplistic calculator, maybe an FVS, or there's some independent ones out there, and they basically come up with this estimation of canopy height profiles, and this is canopy bulk density profile here on the right hand side. And so in most cases that works pretty well. There's some limitations to those type of models that's based on the geographic location that they were developed, the range distribution, basically the diameter distribution and height distribution of the trees that were used to develop the model. These models are developed by basic destructive harvest, where a crew would go out and cut a tree down, and they would section that tree into like 1 meter increments, and they would completely tear it apart and weigh individual fuel components so that we can basically describe that tree based on the mass and where it was in the canopy. So in many cases, these models are based on 40 to 50 trees, and we're using those sort of ubiquitously across the landscape. And if we end up getting outside of the diameter range of those trees, then the model's performance starts to really suffer. So the model is going to do a decent job in some cases of depicting reality, and so that's fine, all fine, well and good in those cases. In some cases, though, we run into these sort of strange circumstances, or this is a particularly strange circumstance because Pinus rigida resprouts epicormically. So there was obviously a crowning fire through this stand, and this picture was taken a month after the fire, and you can see the needles starting to pop back out, and you can see the candles starting to work up the base of this tree. The issue is that when we're doing prescribed fire, or we have a wildfire, or any kind of damage to the canopy or a stand that something has basically happened to, the allometric models are going to essentially fall apart. And in this case, if you applied the allometric model that we used in the last slide to this tree, you would end up with the same exact distribution of fuels as though the tree had not been burned. And so there's an issue there. There's a really disjunct relationship there between the estimate from the model and the reality. And so what I really want to get at here is that it's difficult to really get at any type of variability with these plot level allometric estimates. There's a bit of uncertainty related in there that we need to overcome. And so, and the other thing that we need when we're trying to estimate canopy bulk density is we need to have a spatial understanding and a spatial picture of what is there. Many of these stands have a tremendous amount of variability, and we're not really capturing that with plot level estimate in many cases. And when we are using plot level estimates, we're not characterizing any spatial representation of what's going on. We're typically doing some kind of sampling scheme and coming up with a mean and a variance around that. In fire management, I think we need to have a little bit more spatial understanding of what's going on and an idea spatially of where the fuels are and where they aren't. And in the case of New Jersey, it's particularly striking. You'll see in a couple minutes. But so the need really is that we can identify these hazardous fuel areas, we can gauge the effectiveness of our treatments, and that's really, if we go back to this, that's really one of the issues, is that if we have a prescribed burn and we reduce understory fuels and say we have some crown damage, using a plot-based estimator, we really have no way of assessing what happened to the crown, what fuels were actually combusted, what's left. And I think that in many cases that's something that we really need as we're moving forward in other studies looking at prescribed fire effectiveness or emissions or other things like that. Another thing that we need, we're running into these sort of three-dimensional spread models now that need to have a much more explicit understanding of where the fuels are in the canopy, and we need to have a way to populate those models and to give them an accurate input. And so there's sort of this, I see there being a pretty great need for basically three-dimensional mapping of canopy fuels. And these issues I've already gone over pretty much. So the tack that we've taken with this is that LiDAR data presents us with a really interesting tool to sense these canopy fuels. And LiDAR, sort of in its most simplest form, is an active form of remote sensing. So basically, we're pulsing a beam of infrared light, and we are then measuring the amount of time that it takes for the reflectance to come back. And so we have a sensor, and we pulse the light out, basically shine the flashlight on the forest or at the wall or whatever, and then we get a reflection back. And if we know the speed of light, which we do, and we know the amount of time that bounce took, we can figure out what the distance to the target is. And so this is the general, easy principle of LiDAR data. And I mean, these things are pretty simplistic. I'm getting carpet put in my house this week, and the carpet installer had one basically that he used to measure the room instead of a tape measure. So they're pretty commonplace even in our regular lives. We're using something that's a little bit more hopped up, and we're basically putting one of these sensors in an aircraft, and we're spinning it across the landscape. So we're getting thousands of returns at a very high rate. And we're able to figure out using high accuracy GPS and an IMU where those returns are coming from spatially across the landscape. And so this gives us a great amount of data, basically. So one of the real issues with LiDAR data is just the sheer volume of the data set, and terabytes of data. We did a recent collection, and I think I have 2 terabytes of data for 700 square miles. So it's very ungainly and unwieldy, and it's still not quite simplistic to deal with that amount of data. So this is an example of what a ALS point cloud, so airborne laser scanning LiDAR point cloud, looks like. I like to use this one. There's a fire tower here. If you look down here on the bottom side, there's a fire tower in this image, and this is older data. This is from 2004 in New Jersey. So if you look at the top, you're looking directly down on that fire tower right here. Here's the cab, and the red returns are the higher returns, and the blue returns are pretty much ground in this case. And then here we just sort of tilted that on its side so we could have a sideways view at the same image. One of the primary data products that come out of these LiDAR acquisitions is digital elevation models. I'm not sure where this model is from, but you can see here that we get pretty accurate. I think it's probably 10-meter ground resolution on this, so not even a very highly accurate digital elevation model. But you can see the level of detail that we get in this drainage right here. And this is what it would look like, if we kept the canopy points in also. So this first image is basically the points that were identified as ground points, the lowest points. And the second image is the tallest points in the scene, and they're draped with a digital orthophoto. So canopy height model here and digital elevation model here. So the sort of the weird thing with LiDAR data is that an individual point doesn't represent much of anything, especially in a forested system. With just one point, it's just a simple XYZ triplet of data, and it doesn't necessarily mean anything unless you have other points around it to relate it to. And so in this image, you could start to get a better picture of what's really going on in that same grid space, whereas the first one, you really don't know if that's a canopy hit or a ground hit or anything. So one of the real challenges with LiDAR data is to take those terabytes of data and to reduce them down into statistics that we can use more easily. And so for each grid cell, if you're in, or your kitchen tile floor, however you want to think of it, we basically subdivide the data based on some kind of gridded system. So depending on the density of the data, it could be 10 meters by 10 meters or 20 meters by 20 meters. But each of those cells has basically a grouping or a distribution of LiDAR returns. And from that distribution of LiDAR returns or grouping of LiDAR returns, we can extract simple statistics for each of those cells, like a mean return, a maximum return, and a percentile height. So if we draped over that scene that I showed you before, that drainage, we could drape a grid over that, and we would end up having a mean height for every grid cell within that scene. And that's one of the real it's an important concept, is that we're basically taking, in this case, probably 1,000 points, and we're reducing that down into maybe 10 different statistics that we can then use to develop models. One of the things that's, like I said before, I wanted you to look at that canopy height density or canopy bulk density profile that I showed you before, is that that canopy bulk density profile is striking as how similar it looks to a canopy height profile derived from LiDAR data. And so on the left here, we have 3 different examples. This is my old office, not my current office. 3 different examples of different sort of canopy structure. So on the bottom, you have a cabin, and you have a couple trees over the top of it. Here you have a pretty well-developed pine plantation where we don't really have very much mid-story or understory. And at the top, we have an oak stand that has a decent amount of mid-story in it. And so if we just basically bin our returns for one of these cells, again, the same idea, this is a single pixel or a single cell, we can end up with a distribution of canopy height returns for that cell. One of the problems is that there's this thing, it's basically optical occlusion, so that a return has a really high chance of hitting something in the top of a canopy. And as you go down through the canopy, that return, there's less of a chance that you're actually going to get a return. So you're missing data basically in the bottom of the canopy, where returns that would have hit something basically hit a leaf right above the leaf that you want to hit. And so we have to transform these data to more accurately depict what's in the understory. And so there's been several papers published on this, but it's an important concept to understand. Otherwise, you're basically over-predicting the top of the canopy and under-predicting the understory. So the first study I want to talk about is this idea of using those allometrically derived canopy bulk density estimates from a plot, and I want to build a model to be able to predict that outside of the plot. So I want to go from a plot-based sampling scheme, and I want to use LiDAR data to fill in the gaps, basically to create the wall-to-wall map. And in this case, we use the canopy bulk density calculator that was actually developed by Matthew Duvenek for pitch pine. And we went out and censused a bunch of plots, and we pushed those plots through the canopy bulk density calculator, and we ended up with a canopy bulk density estimate for each of those plots, and then we directly related it back to the airborne LiDAR data spatially. And what we end up doing is basically, with the LiDAR data, is deriving these 25-layer stacks. And this comes back to the pixel idea that I showed you before. So it doesn't exactly look like a Rubik's Cube, but if you can imagine this as a Rubik's Cube, where each of the the colors on the cube is a 25 by 25 by 25 sort of volume, or it's 25 horizontally by 25 horizontally and 1 meter vertically. So 1 meter vertical step through the canopy. And the bottom of this cube is the 0 to 1 meters above the forest floor, and then the top of the cube is the top of the canopy. In this case, I think it cut off after 8 meters. And if you look over here, you can see this in the upper right-hand corner, the red picture there. That's basically a 2-county area for bin 1, so from 0 to 1 meters above the canopy, where red is high value and the white is a high value, I'm sorry, and the red is a lower value. And it's the same thing with bin 5, where the dark green is a low value and the whiter is a high value. And what we can essentially do is create a RGB image of these 3 different canopy height bins overlaid here in the bottom right, and you can get an idea of what the spatial variability and heterogeneity of the landscape is there. And I'll just point out a couple places where it sticks out. So you have to think of this as color additive. So where there's only red, that means that bin 1 is really, there's a lot of fuel in bin 1, and there's not any fuel in the other parts. And I don't know how many of you would even be familiar with this, but this is actually the pine plains in the New Jersey pine barrens. So this forest pretty much peaks out at 2 meters. This is very dense scrub pine and oak that doesn't grow any taller than 2 meters, and so you can see that vividly stands out here. Where there's blue, that means that the overstory really vividly is popping, and there's a lot of fuel in the overstory and not really very much anywhere else. And the purple would be a combination, basically, where there's a lot of fuel in the overstory and a lot of fuel in the understory. So just sort of visually, this is one of the first things that we looked at where we thought that this might actually be kind of an interesting idea. So just one more little view here of the complexity of the landscape that you can see with this data. This is an overview of, again, that same county area in RGB again. And this is the Warren Grove bombing range right here, where actually we had a large, they basically keep the New Jersey Forest Fire Service in business. They've probably had about 4 of the last 6 or 7 major fires initiate at the range or because of the range. But they have a very extensive prescribed burn program. And you can see here that these blocks that are completely black are essentially completely black. I mean, these were head fired. And in here you can see these roads. And the section right here is actually, this is backfire that sort of undercut the canopy. So you can really differentiate these crown runs, and you can really start to see some of the sort of spatial patterning of the fuel load in this system. Down here, you can see this. There was a flare dropped in 1999 right here. And so this is fire origins right here. We had an east wind. You can see this fire spreading this way in this pattern right here, this ellipse. So I just wanted to give you sort of an idea of what the spatial patterning is. If you looked at I should have brought it up, but I didn't. If you looked at a color ortho photo of this same scene, it would look all the green. It would look like pitch pine canopy with no variability. So as a result of this first study with allometrically estimated canopy bulk density, you can see in that scattered plot right there that we did a relatively reasonable job predicting canopy bulk density. And that's actually at individual bins in the canopy, so from 0 to 1 meters, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4. So it's pretty high resolution, and we were pretty happy with that. But as I said before, there's these issues in the use of allometric equations and relationships that we wanted to get over. And so our next step in this process was a Joint Fire Science grant to basically do destructive harvest that was coupled with sequential profiling LiDAR acquisitions. And this profiling LiDAR is backpack borne. And the reason we use this is because it's just too expensive to get a aircraft to come in and refly the same piece over and over again as we were doing this harvest project. And so our strategy here, which it's sort of pseudo-replicated, but we really didn't have much of a choice. Our strategy here was to take 5 plots, 20 by 20 meter plots, and basically to walk this profiling LiDAR in 20 meter increments through the plot, so 1 meter increments through the plot, and to then basically do a destructive harvest, that like I talked about before, and to limb and section and divide all the trees in that plot. But we did it 5 trees at a time. So we would walk the LiDAR, and then we would cut 5 trees down. And hold on a second, my computer's starting to try to reset itself. Okay, saved. We would cut 5 trees down and re-walk the LiDAR. And then we would cut 5 more trees down and re-walk the LiDAR until the plot came back basically to 0. And then, so when we got to the end, we had about 8 acquisitions for each plot, and we had a really good understanding of what the fuels were and where they were in the plot for each of those acquisitions. And we were able to develop regression models to predict the values within those plots. And so this is a pretty good scatter for that. And this table really shows how well we were able to estimate the different fuel components within the canopy. And so you can see for available fuels, we did that model has a really explains a very high amount of the variance. And we also did a very good job with needles and 1-hour fuels. You can see as you move down the list, as we get to larger fuels, stems, and larger branches, we do a much worse job. And that's primarily attributed that we're sensing the canopy and not really necessarily the stems. So in this case, the density of the stems doesn't really matter. We can't really predict that. We're basically directly estimating the fuels that are in the canopy. And it's important that we be able to do that for another study that I'll talk about in a minute. So one of a recent study that we submitted recently was this idea of using LiDAR data to look at fuels around the wildland-urban interface. And looking at this, we really thought that we would be able to take sort of an individual structure approach and estimate fuels pretty accurately. And basically the question was, can we measure these differences within communities and between structures? And so what we did was we took this test community, which has about 5,000 houses in this left-hand image. And you can see this community up here was actually impacted by the 2007 Warren Grove wildfire. They lost several houses and had several more damaged. And what we did, if you look over to the right, around each individual structure, we drew this sort of bullseye. And instead of using a grid, like I talked about before, to extract the LiDAR parameters, we used each of these sort of firewise bullseyes to extract canopy fuel parameters around each individual house. And this is sort of an example of what that looks like. So in the upper left here, we have a sort of intermix house, and we were able to draw this 100-foot buffer around it, and then we extracted the point cloud only for that house, and we were able to describe the canopy bulk density profile for that individual house. Here is another example, a much different example in a more suburban and tightly clustered area. We did the same thing, drew the buffer around it, excluding the other houses, of course, and we were able to see that it's actually this blue line here. You can't really even see it. The green is the mean of the two. And here in the bottom right, we compared that to a Firewise community survey that the New Jersey Forest Fire Service had undertaken. So they essentially had hired Job Corps kids to go out and to do rapid assessment on these houses. And so we had a pretty large database of validation data. And so you can see how that really related. So from that, we're able to derive sort of several fuel products, and this has also used a bit of high-resolution orthophotography to do the delineation of the percent coniferous forest, which in New Jersey is the simple fuel model. And so the top left-hand corner, you can see the depiction of all of the houses that are assigned canopy bulk density category based on their 100-foot Firewise buffer. You can see the ladder fuels also. It's kind of interesting to note that the houses, that the areas where the fire impacted, you can really see that they have a lower canopy bulk density value than many of the other houses that are adjacent to the forest. So we take these four different categories, and we can basically develop a composite fire risk map for this area that can then be used to guide fuel mitigation activities or community preparedness planning or something like that. So it's a pretty cool little study. One of the other things that we did in this really briefly is Jersey has really small lots, and we wanted to look at the percentage of each house that the folks could actually do fuel mitigation around their own house. And so we drew the Firewise circle, and then we looked at the actual parcel polygons and looked at how much of that 100-foot buffer they were actually able to do anything on their own without having to talk to their neighbor or something else. And so you can see in here there's very few, even right up against the forest, there's very few folks that are actually would be able to actually implement the 100-foot buffer around their own house. So this is the last study I want to talk about today, and this is sort of what we've been working on recently. It's another joint fire science project, and basically looking at the efficacy of fuel reduction treatments on canopy fuels. And again, in New Jersey in the Pine Barrens. And for this project, we looked at 34 individual prescribed burn treatments across the landscape. And this gives you an idea of what sort of the variability within each of those treatments look like. This is actually a really small experimental burn. It was only 18 acres. But it gives you some idea of the intensity and the mosaic that you can see following a fire in the pines. This is another example of that at the bombing range, actually. So on the top, it's a pre-fire image, and then when you go to the bottom, it's post-fire. And this is the LiDAR canopy height model. So basically, the highest return in the LiDAR point cloud at a 1-meter resolution. And so at the top, you can see pre-fire, and then the bottom, you can see what the post-fire looks like. This case on the left-hand side is really quite interesting. There's the reports about the fire behavior that day were kind of crazy, and there was definitely a firewall sighting. There's conflicting information about what the winds were doing, but you can see in here how the fire just sort of ate around and the patterning that the crown fire had. Very, very cool. And then over on this side, you can just sort of see a single linear crown run that took off in this fire, so a really steady wind behind that fire. So within that sampling design, we had 120 by 20 meter fuel plots where we did basic fuel inventory, grab sampling, and understory fuel sampling. And you can see where those are spatially across the landscape. And then, because this is a before and after treatment, and we already said we couldn't really estimate crown fuel reduction using any plot-based metrics, we broke out the old terrestrial LiDAR that we had walked through those other plots, and we used it to measure canopy fuels in those plots before and after the fire. So basically that was our indication of, on the ground, what happened to the canopy. And we did about 34 of those plots, and 21 transects in each plot before and after the fire. And so that basically became our calibrating data for the ALS, for the airborne laser scanner. And so in this sampling design, we also used an ALS collection. Before the fire, we collected about 776 square miles of airborne laser scanner data. And following treatments this spring, we reflew at exactly the same time of year. We reflew these strips so that we could resample the blocks that had burned. This is a plot level example of what this data looks like. So this top is a single plot, and this would be pre-treatment. The red line is the airborne laser scanner data. These are canopy bulk density profiles, and the blue line is the profile data. And so you can see that we have pretty good agreement in the pre-treatment and the post-treatment for this plot. It's really good, and you can see how close we were to estimating the loss in canopy bulk density from the fire. So you can see that in the understory we didn't lose quite as much as we did sort of in this mid-story part of the canopy in this case. So that's an example of what we wanted and what we sort of hoped for throughout the project, that we were going to see this kind of pattern. Unfortunately, this is still sort of a developing technology, and we do have some cases like this second plot down here where the pre-treatment and the post-treatment actually look pretty okay, but it looks like there was some over-prediction or under-prediction, either one, from the profiler or the airborne scanning data, and so we end up with a pretty substantial disagreement between what was actually combusted in this fire. And so this data we've only had for a couple months, so we're still looking at maybe some systematic issues as to why that's happening. This is what the scatter looks like, though, for the airborne scanning data for the pre-fire acquisition only. So we're predicting canopy fuels with an R-square of 0.88, and this is individual bins through the canopy, and this is what it looks like after the fire. again, individual bins through the Canopy. So very stable relationships, and they both really mimic each other pretty well. And then we also sort of aggregated measurements for each of the individual 34 plots that we had. So we were looking at maximum canopy bulk density for each plot and canopy fuel loading for each plot. And you can see what that's what these scatters look like here. So canopy fuel loading pre, canopy fuel loading post, maximum canopy bulk density, and maximum canopy bulk density post. So again, you know, they're pretty good. They're pretty good models and pretty good relationships. So when we look at actual individual height bin change estimation, we sort of end up with this nasty shotgun blast here. And one of the reasons for this is that many of these fires were low intensity backing fires that didn't really get into the canopy. And so the middle shotgun blast is basically just going to be sensor error. There's probably not a change that happened in many of these pixels, and that's just the variability between the acquisitions and the sensors. When we look down at this tail, though, we can start to see some development of a better regression relationship with some of the stands that actually did have substantial canopy damage. So it's really been quite encouraging to us. And again, when we aggregate to this canopy fuel load or to the maximum CBD change, you can see that we do a much better job on the plot level at estimating loss from the fire, especially with regard to the maximum canopy bulk density. So this will be the last slide, but one of the things that we really want to do is start to link some of these spatial changes and spatial patterns with fire progression. And so this is on the right-hand side is an infrared image of a prescribed fire that we did where we have a plane basically flying in orbit over the fire. And you can see this last slide coming up here, basically what the intensity of that fire was following the fire. And one of the things that we'd really like to do is try to link this sort of infrared release to the pre and the post canopy fuel loading. And it's sort of a chicken or an egg kind of question, but this is one of the spatial analysis that we're trying to undertake with this. So that's it, and I'm sorry I talked so long.
Oh, you were fine, Nick. That was really interesting. So if anyone has questions, go ahead and type your questions in, and we'll get to those. So I have a couple I'll start with as we're waiting for everyone else to type theirs in. You mentioned that these could be used for designing fuel treatments. Could you expand on that a little bit about, you know, what would be some of the practical questions of someone if someone is wanting to use this?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I think more of it is maybe not designing the fuel well, I guess designing the fuel treatment itself also, but more the sort of larger landscape scale strategy of where you're going to implement your fuel treatments. You know, I think I actually skipped a sentence in here somewhere, but there was, you know, that when we're planning fuel reduction treatments, you're taking a bunch of factors into account. You're taking into account sort of the location of your interface area, of individual structures, the fuel type. You're taking into account your road access, your aspect, all of these sort of factors when you're sort of trying to make this overall plan of what you're going to do. And I really think that one of the things that we're missing right now is the ability to actually look at where the fuel loads are the highest, other than sort of anecdotal back of the envelope estimation. You know, I mean, and I've worked in Jersey for a long time, and I know that that the section fire wardens there know where their problem spots are. I mean, they know it in their head where their problem spots are, and that's a part of their planning. But that doesn't cut it for them when they're trying to justify what they're doing, especially when it comes up to like habitat concerns or T&E issues. You know, especially in Jersey right now, it seems like there's a great need for them to be able to, you know, accurately say, this is why we're doing this. This is why we're attacking this piece of land as opposed to this piece over here.
Right. Okay. Well, while you were answering that one, a flood of questions came in, so I'll start working through them. Deping Lee asks, what kind of special software did you use to analyze the LiDAR data? Nick, you there?
Yeah, I'm here, Josh. Sorry,
oh, okay.
I use a software called TIFS, T-I-F-S, and it's it's not really that expensive to use. It's a commercial off-the-shelf software program, and I only use it because I've been using it forever. But if you look, I don't know if my screen is still up, but
It is, yeah.
there's a U.S. Forest Service product called Fusion that will essentially do exactly what TIFFs will do also. And there's a bunch of other software suites that are starting to be able to really simply process these data. Another one is LAS tools, LAS tools, but Fusion is a great one, and it's it's free.
Okay. Next question is from Aaron Poznanovic, and he asks, how did you actually calculate CBD? What was your workflow?
Well, for the modeling portion, where we use the allometric models, I mean, that's all pretty much spreadsheet work, where we're inputting into the calculator, basic like stand parameters for each tree. So the basal area, the height, the crown class of that individual tree, that's going into the calculator and spitting back out. For the destructive harvest work, we basically the workflow was brutal. We bagged everything up and we took it all home and weighed it. We did very little subsampling. We did subsample most of the bolls in that case, but each tree was individually fallen, and it was then marked in 1 meter increments, and it was basically dissected and bagged. So that material went back to the lab, it was dried, and it was then basically put into a spreadsheet so that we had, we knew where every needle on every tree went back together. I think that's what you want to know. But that's how we did it. There was no good workflow. That was just brute force. That was some awesome. There was some awesome work by a bunch of people.
Okay. Next question from Peter Yang. How did you get the fire risk map? Did it come from the fuel models or directly from the LiDAR-derived canopy bulk density?
The fuel models that we used, we used an estimated fuel model. Jersey's pretty much all SH8 and SH9, and so we decided in that case that it would be better to use a % coniferous cover as the indication of what the fuel classification was. And so we used a classified high-res ortho with IR image to differentiate canopy at a really high resolution, and then estimated the percentage of pine pixels within like a 10-meter area. So the rest of those were derived from the LiDAR, from the canopy bulk density model and mapping. For the overall risk map, I'll go back up. It was just a simple additive process. We used some factors some factor analysis to come up with what we, and through discussion with some other folks, what we thought was the most important. I think it was like the scaling factor for fuel was a 1, and the scaling factor for canopy bulk density was a 1, but for ladder fuels it was a half. It was somewhat subjective.
Okay. William Johnson wants to know if you can talk a little bit about the cost for obtaining this information.
Yeah, so recently the cost has really gone down. I'm trying to think of what, I wish I could bring my spreadsheet up right now. The cost, 10 years ago was really expensive, but I think that for 776 square miles, I think it was $100 a square mile, I believe. Let me check my math. But the cost in that case, for this big joint fire science project, 100 times 776. Yeah, that's right, $100 a square mile. We paid just under that. One of the issues though is the ferry time. So you're going to pay a pretty substantial cost up front just to get the plane or the contractor to your location. And in that case, the contractor was coming pretty far, so we paid a substantial amount of money to have that plane show up on location. And then once they're there, though, the cost of acquisition and collection goes down by a factor based on the amount of area you're surveying. So it'll be much cheaper. It was much cheaper for us to do the initial 776 square miles per mile cheaper than it was for us to do the follow-on acquisitions of 100 and 200 square miles, for example. So once the contractor's there and they're proceeding, the cost can go down. But $100 a square mile is pretty good, and I've seen a couple other. I was just at a remote sensor conference last week, and that seems to be a pretty reasonable price at this point.
Okay. You might have answered this earlier, but George Kipp wants to know what software you used to segment the LiDAR returns into the Rubik's Cube matrix.
Yeah, it was that TIFF software again. It basically outputs a. You can have an output like the number of returns as a raster for each level. That's what that is. There's a little bit more post-processing from that to actually calculate the canopy bulk density. And if you look in that 2011 Skowronski et al. Paper, a remote sensing environment, it's spelled out in there. It's pretty easy to understand. But I mean, the key is to get the returns per slice per grid cell. That's the key.
Okay. Jill Beckman asks, did you actually do corrections to the LAS CVD estimates using the allometric field data, or just compare them to each other?
No, we did. We developed the model to predict the canopy bulk density from the ALS. It's not a one-to-one relationship right off the bat. With the profiling LiDAR, interestingly enough, it almost is a one-to-one relationship. The profiling LiDAR that we use for some, and this is completely random, but it almost exactly predicts canopy bulk density to the number without very much correction. But the scanning LiDAR data sets each have to have some correction factor added onto them. And I guess this is a good point to really illustrate that not all of these LiDAR acquisitions are the same. That many times, if you develop a model for LiDAR acquisition 1 and then a different contractor flies a different laser at different parameters for LiDAR acquisition 2, those models are not going to work the same. They're going to be different. The spot size changes, the spectral attributes change, what they're digitizing changes, and so you have to be very careful that you use plot data that is consistently dated with each LiDAR acquisition. When we did our repeat acquisitions, I specified that we use the same sensor, identically the same sensor, and so we were able to control for that. But in many cases, sort of the publicly available LiDAR data, which I have a link here for you guys. There's a data clearinghouse with publicly available LiDAR. Those data are not identical. There's different parameters associated with each data set, and so you have to be really careful about that.
Okay. John Hamm asks, what determines grid size, LiDAR density or vegetation density?
That's a good question, and it's actually probably a combination of both. Generally, you want to look at the density of your ground returns. It also matters what your topography is. Jersey's like a pool table. It's absolutely an ideal place to do LiDAR work. We have a relatively open canopy, and we have almost zero topography other than landfills. So that question is really dependent on those three things. It's the density of the vegetation, the penetration rate of the LiDAR, and also the need to accurately depict the ground. In a high slope area, you have to get that right.
Okay.
And there's publications out on that too.
Okay. Next is a similar question from Frankie Lake. Does the size or area of the plot used affect your analysis of the LiDAR, 20 meters by 20 or 30 meters by 30? Pros and cons for plot size and or shape, circular or rectangular?
Yep. So one of the nice things with TIFFs as far as circular or regular goes, it's they basically have it so you can clip it out based on a shape file. Then you basically extract the LiDAR data for whatever shape you're using, and you want to keep that close to what your final grid output size is going to be. But circular or rectangular, I don't think really matters that much. It's been shown that larger plot sizes are much better for any kind of remote sensing data model building. Especially in the tropics, they've done many studies on that, and it's definitely been shown that the larger plot size is better. The only issue that I have with that is you're sort of aggregating what's going on in the landscape, but edge effects are a big problem with LiDAR data. If you have a large tree that's sort of hanging over your plot and you're not actually grabbing it when you're doing your sample, that can have a pretty dramatic influence on your on your output. So it's basically an edge effect issue. You know, you want to your plot size needs to be to the scale of the variability of the forest that you're looking at, really.
Okay. Stephen Filippelli writes, LiDAR has a great ability to penetrate through the canopy surface to measure the mid and understory, which makes it excellent for estimating CVD. Do you know if this approach has been successfully applied with photogrammetric point clouds, which may only capture the canopy surface?
Yeah, I have arguments with people about this pretty often, but you know, the point clouds from the imagery, from the digital imagery, are really only getting the outside of the canopy. You know, there's no penetration at all, and so if you have a relationship that's pretty strong between, you know, whatever they're deriving, whatever height metric they're deriving in canopy bulk density, that would be fine. But if your understory canopy bulk density or midstory is decoupled from that, then you're really going to have issues, and you're not going to see what's actually, you know, what the actual fuel status is of that stand. You know, it would be like trying to take a picture through a wall. You're not really describing that.
Okay. Peter Joria writes, I might have missed it, but how did you adjust for occlusion of the LiDAR pulse, fewer returns from lower in the canopy when modeling to the allometric estimates?
Yeah, if you go, I think I have that in that 2011 paper also. I'll go back up here. There was a paper published in like 1962 where they did line transects, and they had an optical occlusion. And I cannot remember the guy's name right now, of course. But they did just that, where they were able to recalibrate photographs actually with a line transect. And so you can apply that correction to LiDAR data also, and that's what this figure shows right here, is basically the center pictures here, the center graphs are showing the real proportion of returns through the canopy. And then when we apply that correction for optical occlusion, you can see that we're starting to pick up the understory and the midstory much better in those stands that have it. And if I'll look for that reference. If you want to send me an email, I'll happily give that to you. I did it in a more simplistic way, using a through-fall estimation also, and there's really no difference between what they came up with and what I used. But basically, you're calculating a percent cover for each bin, but ignoring the number of returns above that bin. So, you know, if I don't think it would be worth trying to explain right now. But if you have, I can explain it in an email really easily. But yeah, we definitely do that.
Okay. William Johnson asks, how feasible would it be to produce a national wall-to-wall product similar to Landfire?
You know, there's been talks for a couple years about this national elevation data set, and they basically want to do just that. The issue that I see, it's not going to be consistent data sets. It's going to be a million different contractors, so that would be difficult. It would also be a difficult remeasure. You know, that data is going to, by the time that data was probably publicly available, it would be 2 years later, and a lot of things would change. You know, just like the Landfire maps, really. But update would be an issue. It would be pretty expensive. One of the things that is perhaps going to go online is this JEDI LiDAR that's going to be attached to the space station for 2 years, but that's 7 years down the road, and it's going to be a sampling. It's not going to be wall to wall. So it's feasible. We could do it if we wanted to, but I'm not sure that it would ever, you know, really be that simple to take that data and make it into a nationally consistent data set.
Okay. Ioannis Mitsopoulos asks, canopy base height and/or fuel strata gap is also a critical parameter for crown fire initiation. Did you find any strong relationship between CBH with LiDAR metrics?
Yeah, we and I didn't present it today, but a couple of the papers that we've presented have looked at canopy base height specifically. One of the things that we've done actually is fit distributions to these data, like idealized distributions, to be able to identify those areas. So yeah, it's completely feasible, and it's a very strong correlation.
Okay. John Moncourt asks, how accurate is the LiDAR process for analyzing gaps in the forest canopy suggesting fire intensities?
Yeah, so the actual object height models that we're coming up with some of the canopy field work that we're doing with the reductions it's really it's high accuracy, but more so than what we know what to do with at this point. It's accurate enough for that. We've been struggling with linking the before fire and post fire LiDAR, and there's several inconsistencies that we've been coming across in the data that have really sort of precluded us from making those kind of statements. But yeah, there's a whole line of research there for gap formation. I did some gap transition work a couple years ago with gypsy moth defoliation, and we were able to with really high confidence predict gaps that happen in oak canopies following gypsy moth defoliation and subsequent mortality. And so, it was actually a 3-time series, and so we were able to look at what proportion of the pixels started as a gap or null gap, and look at how they changed through three time series over 5 years. So that stuff is out there, but it's really hard to validate.
Okay. George Kipp asks, when you developed the RGB composite of heights, did you extract building/road footprints?
No, not for that countywide estimate. I did not. I just mainly because we're mostly concentrated on the canopy in the forest, so I didn't. That adds a considerable amount of time. For the wildland-urban interface work, we did mask out any building footprints. Those were all hand digitized, and all of that data was excluded from those analyses. But the one that I showed you of the 2 counties did not exclude that. But I will tell you that in the center of that, that big glob of fuels, there's not very many houses out there. So it's not really a huge deal in that case.
Okay. Mitzi Wigman asks, am I understanding correctly that your studies have indicated that terrestrial LiDAR plot sampling works better than traditional plot surveys? What is involved with terrestrial LiDAR plot surveying?
Okay, so the terrestrial system that we're using is a very unsophisticated transect technique, and it when used so we'll have our 20 by 20 meter plot, and we'll basically run 21 transects through that plot, and it's really just sampling what's directly above your head. It's not one of these really fancy TLS systems, terrestrial laser scanner systems that's mapping out every individual needle and angle. This is a much more simplistic and rudimentary system. From the analysis, though, I would say that it does predict better than the scanning LiDAR data, but there's reason for that. One of the reasons is that the spot size on that profiling system is much smaller than what it would be from the scanning LiDAR system. So a scanning footprint is probably going to be 30 centimeters as it comes down through the canopy, so you have much less chance of actually penetrating with an individual scanning pulse as you would penetrating outward through the canopy with that profiling laser. So that it's much more accurate because of that. It's also more accurate just because spatially we know that we're in the plot with that data, so we don't have any GPS error term. We know exactly where we're at. We know we're in the plot with the system, so if our plot corner is off by a meter, it doesn't really affect us because we still measured those trees. With the scanning LiDAR, you're running into those kind of geolocation issues. So in our study in 2011, I think that it's slightly predicted better than the scanning LiDAR did, but it sort of has an unfair advantage. So the pro is, yeah, you can probably, your R-squared is probably 5% better with the profiler. The con is that you're in a 20 by 20 meter plot as opposed to 700 miles in the case of the ALS.
Okay. Jonathan Gallagher asks, can you remind me what the resolution is on your LiDAR data? Your resources page listed earthexplorer.usgs.gov as the location of the data, do these data have the same resolution?
Well, the stuff on the resource page is really just publicly available LiDAR that is basically flown by water management districts or a state or anybody really, and then that just becomes a repository. So I can't really speak to the density of that data. The data that we collected for our most recent Canopy Fuels and Prescribed Fire project, that was at about, I believe, six postings per meter squared, so pretty high density. But you know, it depends on what you're looking at. For us in New Jersey, we could probably go to 4 or 2 even and be pretty well off. You know, it just depends on the canopy. That comes back to that question before. It depends on how dense the canopy you're looking at is and what your topography is.
Okay.
And our data is not on that site quite yet, but it will be within the next year here. It will become publicly available.
Okay. Hey, you mentioned a couple times that people could email you for some of these questions. Do you have your email up on one of your slides? Is it on your final slide there?
I'll throw it on there.
There you go. Maybe you can type it in there. Okay. While Nick's doing that, I'll go to the next question. This is similar to the one that I asked earlier, but maybe you can expand on one part of this. Charles Ichoku asks, are you following developments with the future IC Sat-2 mission? And he lists a link to that. I can maybe try to copy that and paste it for people who can't see it. What are the prospects of applying satellite LiDAR to fuel mapping globally at the fine scale you have demonstrated?
Well, it's never going to be, well, I won't say it's never. In our careers, it's probably not going to be ever applied at the scale that we're looking at here. You know, the space LiDAR has a whole nother suite of challenges that's associated with it, and getting wall-to-wall coverage just is not going to happen right now with where the technology is. I'm not sure about this, so don't quote me on it, and I shouldn't check the status of that ISAT mission. I'm not sure what's going on with that right now. My impression is that may have run into some hurdles. There, like I said before, there is the new JEDI LiDAR that's going to be going on the space station. But that data will be available in like 9 years, and it's going to be one posting. I think it's sub-kilometer resolution, but it's going to be a sampling. It's not going to be wall to wall.
Okay, I posted Charles sent a link to the IC Sat-2 project, and I put that in the chat. So if you can grab the link there if you need it.
Okay.
The next question is from Stefania Di Tommaso. What LiDAR parameters / layers, max height, mean height, standard deviation was used for regression with CBD?
It was all, you know, for everything that we're doing here, and I've done a lot of biomass work too, so I have used mean height and like the percentile heights and all those other metrics and statistics. But here it was the canopy height profile, or the LiDAR-derived canopy height profile. So essentially a corrected proportion of returns through the canopy at each bin, and then those were directly related in a one-to-one fashion to each of the canopy height bins. So we didn't do a stepwise model here, all subsets model, where we looked at 50 different variables. We just looked at each individual variable in a single linear regression.
Okay. This question is from Joshvar Kunapo. How accurately could you estimate understory below a thick overstory using your method?
Well, again, it's going to depend on the density of the LiDAR data, and you know, it's really hard to say. I think that you could do it to some extent, but your accuracy is obviously going to suffer, you know, with the more dense canopy that you have present. But you know, you could overcome that with just a much higher resolution or higher pulse density of the LiDAR data.
Okay. Last question I think we got here. This is from Matt Skowronski. Can you speak to if the some of these words I'm not familiar with, photogrammetry derived digital surface models in combination with older LiDAR derived terrain models work as well as getting new LiDAR for your application?
Well, if we're just talking about digital elevation model, then I mean, for the most part, I think that there's going to be a little bit of, I mean, there's not going to be that much change. So I don't think that that would be that much of an issue. You know, the surface isn't changing that much in most places, so it's that I don't see any real advantage of resampling. You know, you might get a higher resolution, but for the most part, unless you have a landslide or if you're looking at like post-burn effects or something like that, then I don't think there would be an advantage to that. But that's just my uninformed opinion on that one, maybe.
Okay. Well, Nick, I want to thank you. That was a very interesting webinar. Very clearly presented. Those, you know, very technical subject, and I was even able to follow what you're talking about. So that was good. And if I can follow it, then there's probably a lot of people. Most people out there should be able to follow it. But yeah, I want to thank you for a great presentation. I want to thank everybody for coming, and we'll be sending out the announcement for the next webinar coming up in early December, and look forward to talking to everyone then. Thanks, Nick.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Thanks, Josh.